Hello again, welcome to this video lecture as part of our European history of Cologne in modern times. This week we will deal with World War I, which, yes, was a war of global scale, but indubitably of European origin. A Eurocentric global war. Let's have a look at the origins, reasons and triggers of the war. Well, the foundation of Germany in 1870 as a new, big and potentially powerful state in the middle of the continent shook the European balance of power, and this is why Bismarck, the first Reichskanzler, conducted a wise and relatively discreet international policy. Moderate, reassuring and focused on weaving a net of partners and allies, a diplomatic web that effectively set France apart, minimizing the risk of conflict with the allegedly suspicious and revengeful neighbor. As you can see, there was some kind of a belt of alliances that would isolate France without being aggressive in itself, because it was all a defensive system of contracts. This wise and restrained attitude changed dramatically under the young and hot-tempered new emperor, Wilhelm II, who took over the reign in 1888 and dismissed Bismarck in 1890, claiming his right for personal government, as he said. His reorientation of German foreign policy proved fatal for Germany and for Europe and ultimately for the world. His colonial ambition, shared by his entourage and promoted with the motto "a place in the sun," even alienated the long-standing ally Russia, led by Wilhelm II's cousin Tsar Nikolaus II. The new Weltmachtstreben, pursuit of global power of the Germans, provoked an insane arm race with Great Britain in the field of naval forces and generated mistrust basically everywhere in Europe. The colonial crises caused by clumsy and pretentious diplomatic behavior of the Germans increased this uneasiness and poisoned the international relations. Ultimately, it led to a rapprochement of France and Great Britain, who had to agree about their colonial policies in order to contain the German colonial activism. Russia, too, preferred to come to agreements with France and Great Britain rather than delivering itself to the unpredictability of the German neighbor. Thus, diplomatic traditions became turned over. The Russian-German alliance just faded away and was not renewed. The French-Russian antagonism was reversed into an alliance. The German-British ties, carefully constructed by Bismarck, broke away, and what used to be the traditional French-British antipathy became in 1904 the Entente Cordiale, a heartfelt agreement. The only remaining ally for Germany was Austria-Hungary in the southeast. Yes, still an empire of remarkable extension, the Habsburg Empire, and a superpower of its time, but a fading one with noticeable problems and of alarming backwardness. Certainly not the best partner for a blind loyalty as the German-Austrian propaganda promoted it. So here we see a graphic realization of the changes in international diplomacy. What originally had been a defensive system of alliances shielding Germany became a diplomatic belt encircling and beleaguering Germany. Though it should be said that again all these anti-German alliances and agreements were truly defensive ones. None of them as such constituted an offensive threat for Germany. The term encircling is therefore misleading. However, there were an international system that excluded Germany and left German international ambitions very limited space. Unfortunately, it was in this period of international strain and tension that another international hotspot collapsed, the Balkans. The Balkans proved to be an uncontrollable region of crisis, due to the ambitions of rivaling nationalities under foreign dominion, and given the relative weakness of basically all three major powers that were competing over predominance in the area: the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The latter certainly the weakest of these three. But Habsburg and Russia were struggling for survival themselves, which made the situation even more precarious. While the Balkan states were struggling for independence and at the same time competing for hegemony, Russia wanted to defend its influence in the Slavic regions and gain access to the Mediterranean. On the other side, Austria had to defend its own interests in the Balkans, as any sign of weakness could provoke the implosion of its multinational empire. Since 1908, actually even earlier with minor uprisings, since 1908 the Balkan was boiling over due to a series of ever more serious crises. Conflicts and finally wars that became increasingly difficult to settle without major clashes of the three big powers in the area. Just to illustrate this dusk or crepuscule of empires, the last of their kind we can see here. Emperor Franz Joseph I around 1910 was the last emperor of the Habsburg Empire, and he had a successor, Karl I, who took over in late 1916 and witnessed the collapse of the empire before abdicating from the throne in late 1918. But Franz Joseph I was clearly the last real emperor of the Habsburg Empire. Then we have in the middle Mehmed V in a picture from 1913. He was the penultimate sultan and caliph of the Ottoman Empire. And on the right, Tsar Nikolaus II around 1907, the last Romanov ruler, the last Tsar, soon to be wiped away by the Russian Revolution in 1917. Before we turn our attention to the World War itself, let me present you some reflections on the nature of international relations in early 20th century. The period from 1815, which is the end of the Napoleonic Wars, to 1914, which is the beginning of World War I, was characterized by surprisingly limited military conflict in Europe, due to increased cooperation and regional coordination of interests. The period is generally considered the first phase of globalization and transnational interconnection of all areas of human activity: economic, commercial, scientific, cultural, even politically. Europe had started to internationally cooperate. This was perceived as a fundamental modern change, even by the contemporaries. Nevertheless, at the same time, we can notice many contradictory movements which were opposed to regional transnationalism and which refused globalization and international cooperation. So we have nationalism that turned from liberal to illiberal, chauvinist or jingoist radicalism. We have social Darwinism that rejected transnational cooperation and preached existential rivalry between the nations. We have furthermore examples of successfully deployed military force that made war appear a legitimate and efficient means of international relations, encouraging armaments, strategy making, and war preparation. So we have the colonial wars, we have the Franco-German War, we have the Russian-Japanese War, and the Balkan Wars. So all this seemed to indicate that there is still place for military maneuver and for military activity. And we have the rising mass journalism and the mass propaganda that heated up public opinion and disseminated nationalist stereotypes and brought nations against each other. Which means that by 1914, despite a developed international cooperation, in particular the conservative national political elites, but also large parts of the mass public, which were, so not only the conservative national political elites, which were still dominating governments everywhere in Europe, but also parts of the population were prepared for and actually waiting for a large-scale military conflict that would finally settle the tensions, purify the ideological dispute, and possibly turn back the clock to the good old times. However, who on 28th of June 1914 murdered the heir of the Habsburg throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, he was a Serbian nationalist who believed that he could promote his country's independence, but the opposite was to be the case. When Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, the Habsburg Empire felt obliged to a strong reaction. I just put that on the screen immediately. They felt obliged for a strong reaction, diplomatically, politically, and possibly also militarily. However, the Russians, of course condemning the assassination as such, warned the Austrians of exaggerated reactions and kept protecting Serbia. Hence, the Austrians, represented by Alexander Graf von Hoyos, a state secretary of Foreign Ministry of Austria-Hungary, sought the support of their German ally, and the Germans willingly left it to Austria to decide and declared full support whatever might come. The so-called Blanco check. A similar agreement was made between France and Russia in a diplomatic mission by mid-July, backing a firm stand of the Russians. By the end of July, Austria delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, which was harsh but not radical, claiming an inquiry of the assassination and an Austrian participation in the investigations. Serbia refused the ultimatum with Russian support. Austria was bound to declare war on Serbia at that point, despite not being physically in a situation to fight due to mismanagement of the army. Russia was bound to mobilize its army in case it had to face an Austrian attack on Serbia, because they were backing Serbia. But the Russian army was even more ponderous and heavy-handed. It needed a forerun of 30 days to become operative, so they had to mobilize immediately. However, that 30 days mobilization need was known by the German generals, who had built their entire strategy on exactly this fact. If the Russians needed a month to get ready for war, this would allow the much better organized German army to first attack and defeat the French, before facing and defeating the Russians. A two-front war, won as a sequence of two single-front wars. That was the solution of the problem, in the eyes of the Germans. And this is why the Germans, though threatened from the east, first turned to the west and declared war to Belgium and France, and immediately started mobilizing and invading both. As a consequence, Great Britain had to declare war to Germany, as the small Belgium, since its existence since 1830, benefited from an International Warranty Act that obliged the signatories to defend it from aggression. Among the signatories, by the way, was also Germany, but given that Great Britain kept to the act, they had to declare war to Germany, protecting Belgium. Given this quick escalation within a few days, Austria-Hungary declared war to Russia too. Europe was in fire. But soon the rest of the world followed. For example, later in August, also Japan declared war to Germany, hoping to take over the Pacific colonial dominions of the Germans, which in fact they did. Yeah, here it is. Well, the official coverage from Germany shows cheering crowds and joyous soldiers who welcomed the coming of war. This is just the official truth. Yes, there were gatherings and official statements in favor of the war, hailed as a purification and a national challenge proudly to be met. But apart from these official statements and rallies, there was also much fear, and entire social layers where worries and sorrow dominated. The socialists in general were strongly opposed, and the communists even loudly protested. But these were parts of the society which were still not as represented as to dominate the public discourse, even if they had constituted the majority. That's all for this video. There is more to come. Thanks for your attention.